They terminated my contract on Monday, March 11th at 2:47 p.m. in a conference room that smelled like stale coffee and corporate desperation. Kelvin Pryor, the new chief technology officer who'd been with the company for exactly 4 months, delivered the news with the confidence of someone who'd never witnessed a real crisis. Emmersson, we're moving in a different direction with our data infrastructure. Your approach is outdated. We need modern cloud-native architecture, and you're still thinking in terms of legacy systems. We're not renewing your consulting contract when it expires Friday. I looked at him across the table. Kelvin was 31 years old, with an impressive resume from 3 Silicon Valley startups that had all been acquired before they'd scaled to any significant size. He'd never managed a database serving 850,000 active customers, processing $340 million in annual transactions. He'd never designed redundancy systems for mission-critical financial data. He'd never spent 22 years building and maintaining the exact type of complex infrastructure he was now calling outdated. I understand, I said. I'll document the handoff procedures for whoever you're transitioning to. That won't be necessary. We're migrating everything to a modern cloud platform. Your documentation is outdated anyway. We'll be fine. My name is Emmersson Caldwell. I'm 52 years old, and I just got fired for being outdated by someone who thinks cloud migration is a solution rather than a tool. Before I explain what happened 3 days later at 11 p.m., let me establish exactly what I'd built over 22 years and why calling it outdated demonstrated fundamental misunderstanding of enterprise database architecture. I started with Halcyon Logistics Group in January 2002 as a database administrator. The company was mid-sized then, about 140 employees, providing supply chain management software to manufacturing companies. My role was maintaining the PostgreSQL databases that stored client data, transaction records, and operational analytics. Over 22 years, that role evolved dramatically. As Halcyon grew from 140 employees to 890 employees, from $8 million in annual revenue to $340 million, from 2,400 customers to 850,000 customers, the database infrastructure I managed became exponentially more complex. By 2024, I was maintaining a distributed database architecture that processed 14 million transactions daily across 17 production database servers, 43 application servers, and 62 microservices. The data infrastructure I'd designed included multi-master replication across 3 geographic regions for redundancy and performance, custom sharding algorithms that distributed data across servers based on transaction patterns and customer geographic distribution, automated failover systems that could detect server failures and redirect traffic within 4.7 seconds, real-time data synchronization protocols ensuring all regional databases maintained consistency within 200 milliseconds, backup and recovery procedures I developed over 2 decades of managing production incidents. Most critically, I maintained institutional knowledge about every architectural decision, every performance optimization, every workaround for edge cases that existed nowhere in documentation. Knowledge that had accumulated over 22 years of hands-on management of systems that evolved organically as business requirements changed. That knowledge was what Kelvin called outdated. Here's what Kelvin didn't understand about enterprise database architecture. Modern and better aren't synonyms. Cloud platforms offer legitimate advantages: scalability, managed services, reduced infrastructure overhead. But they're tools, not solutions. Migrating complex legacy systems to cloud platforms without understanding why those systems were designed their specific way is how you create disasters. Halcyon's database architecture wasn't outdated. It was optimized through 22 years of iterative refinement for Halcyon's specific performance requirements, data consistency needs, and regulatory compliance obligations. Every design choice existed for documented reasons, even if those reasons weren't obvious to someone who'd spent 4 months reviewing PowerPoint presentations about our technical debt. I tried explaining this during my exit meeting. Kelvin wasn't interested. We've hired cloud-scale consulting to manage the migration. They're experts in cloud-native architecture. We'll be in better hands. Cloud-scale consulting. I knew them. They specialized in aggressive cloud migrations for companies that wanted impressive technical modernization stories for their investors. They moved fast, charged premium rates, and left behind systems that looked modern in architecture diagrams, but often performed worse than the legacy systems they replaced. When does the migration start? I asked. Next week. We want to move quickly before our Q2 performance reviews. You're migrating 850,000 customer records, 14 million daily transactions, and 22 years of business logic in less than 90 days during your busiest operational quarter? CloudScale says it's achievable with proper planning. I didn't argue further. You can't teach institutional knowledge in a conference room conversation with someone who's already decided you're obsolete. My contract officially ended Friday, March 15th at 5 p.m. I spent that final week documenting critical procedures, flagging potential risk areas, and preparing transition materials for whoever would be maintaining systems after I left. Most of that documentation was ignored. CloudScale's migration team had their own methodologies and weren't interested in legacy system documentation from the outdated consultant they were replacing. On my last day, I had a brief conversation with Tamsin Lee, Halcyon's Director of Customer Operations. Tamsin had been with the company for 14 years and understood intimately how critical database reliability was to customer satisfaction. Emmersson, I'm worried about this migration. We're in peak season. Customer transaction volumes are 40% higher than normal. This seems like terrible timing for major infrastructure changes. It is terrible timing, but Kelvin wants to show progress quickly. He's optimizing for board presentation metrics, not operational stability. What happens if something goes wrong during the migration? That depends on what goes wrong. If it's performance degradation, customers will experience slower transaction processing. If it's data synchronization issues, transactions might be recorded inconsistently across systems. If it's corruption... I didn't finish the sentence. Tamsin understood the implication. Could you be available if there's an emergency? I'll be starting a new consulting engagement Monday. I won't be available. That was true. I'd spent my final week at Halcyon lining up new clients. By Friday afternoon, I had 3 consulting contracts signed with companies that valued database expertise and weren't interested in reckless modernization projects. I left Halcyon at 5 p.m. on March 15th. Walked out of an office I'd worked in for 22 years, carrying a box with personal items and knowing with absolute certainty that Kelvin's migration timeline was dangerously aggressive and CloudScale's methodology was optimized for speed over safety. The migration started Monday, March 18th. I wasn't there to witness it, but I learned the details later from former colleagues. CloudScale's team began by creating cloud-based replicas of Halcyon's production databases. Their plan was to synchronize data continuously between on-premise and cloud systems until the cloud databases were current, then switch all traffic to cloud infrastructure in a single cutover event, scheduled for Friday, March 22nd at 11 p.m. 4 days to migrate 22 years of database architecture. Fast, aggressive, and completely negligent. The problem started Tuesday. CloudScale's synchronization processes were causing performance degradation on production databases. Transaction processing slowed by 18%. Customer service started receiving complaints about system responsiveness. Kelvin told CloudScale to optimize their synchronization queries. Wednesday, the performance degradation worsened. Transaction processing was 31% slower than normal. Tamsin escalated concerns to Kelvin. He assured her that CloudScale was addressing the issues and performance would normalize after migration completed. Thursday, synchronization processes crashed twice, requiring emergency restarts that caused brief outages. Each outage lasted approximately 4 minutes, long enough to disrupt active customer transactions. Tamsin demanded they pause the migration. Kelvin refused. They were 72 hours from cutover and he didn't want to delay. Friday, March 22nd at 11 p.m., CloudScale executed the cutover. They redirected all application traffic from on-premise databases to cloud databases, decommissioned the on-premise systems, and declared the migration successful. For approximately 40 minutes, everything seemed fine. Then the corruption started. Here's what happened, reconstructed from post-incident analysis. CloudScale's synchronization processes had a subtle bug in how they handled transaction timestamps across time zones. Halcyon's on-premise databases used UTC timestamps for all transactions. CloudScale's cloud databases were configured to use local timestamps for each regional database. That timestamp mismatch didn't cause immediate problems during synchronization because CloudScale's processes converted timestamps on the fly. But when they executed cutover, they disabled the conversion logic to improve performance. Now, transactions were being recorded with inconsistent timestamps across regional databases. The distributed database architecture I designed depended on accurate timestamps to maintain transaction ordering and data consistency. When timestamps became inconsistent, the conflict resolution algorithms that managed multi-master replication started making incorrect decisions about which transaction records were authoritative. At 11:41 p.m., the first data corruption occurred. A customer transaction was processed in the U.S. East database with a timestamp that appeared older than a conflicting transaction in the EU West database. The conflict resolution algorithm decided the EU West record was authoritative and overwrote the US East transaction. That transaction disappeared from the system. At 11:43 p.m., another conflict, another lost transaction. At 11:47 p.m., the corruption accelerated. Dozens of transactions per minute were being lost as timestamp inconsistencies created cascading conflicts across regional databases. At 11:52 p.m., CloudScale's monitoring systems detected the problem. At 11:54 p.m., they attempted to pause transaction processing to diagnose the issue. That's when they discovered they couldn't pause cleanly. The corruption had spread so extensively that attempting to freeze transactions mid-process caused deadlocks across all regional databases. At 11:57 p.m., all three regional database clusters became unresponsive. At 12:03 a.m. Saturday morning, Halcyon's entire production infrastructure crashed. 850,000 customer accounts, 14 million daily transactions, 22 years of business data, all offline. My phone rang at 12:47 a.m. I was asleep. I looked at the caller ID, unknown number, area code 415, San Francisco, where Halcyon maintained their headquarters. I let it ring through to voicemail. 2 minutes later, another call, same area code. I declined it. At 12:52 a.m., a text message. Emmersson, this is Kelvin Pryor. We have an emergency situation with our database systems. Please call me immediately. I turned my phone to silent mode and went back to sleep. At 7:30 a.m. Saturday morning, I woke up to 23 missed calls, 41 text messages, and 7 voicemails. I listened to the most recent voicemail first. It was from Yvette Harmon, Halcyon's CEO. Emmersson, this is Yvette. I understand you're no longer with the company, but we have a catastrophic database failure. Our entire system is down. We've lost access to 850,000 customer records. We can't process transactions. We're losing approximately $180,000 per hour in transaction revenue. CloudScale can't restore the system. Kelvin says you're the only person who understands our database architecture well enough to recover from this type of failure. Please call me as soon as you receive this message. We'll pay whatever consulting rate you require. I made coffee. Checked my email, read the news. At 9:15 a.m., I called Yvette back. Yvette, this is Emmersson Caldwell. I received your voicemail. Emmersson, thank God. How quickly can you get to our offices? We need you to assess the database corruption and develop a recovery plan. I'm currently managing projects for other clients. I'm not available for emergency work. Silence. Long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Emmersson, I need you to understand how serious this is. Our entire business is offline. We can't process customer transactions. We can't access operational data. We've had to tell 850,000 customers that our systems are unavailable. We're losing $180,000 per hour. If we can't restore service by Monday morning, we'll start losing major clients. This could bankrupt the company. That sounds very serious. What does CloudScale recommend? They can't fix it. They're saying the corruption is too extensive and they don't understand the original database architecture well enough to recover safely. They're recommending we restore from the last clean backup, but that backup is from Thursday at 6 p.m., before the cutover. If we restore from that backup, we'll lose 2 days of transaction data. That's approximately 28 million transactions. We can't lose that data. Then you need someone who understands your database architecture well enough to recover corrupted data without losing transactions. That's specialized expertise. That's you, Emerson. You're the only person who has that expertise with our systems. I had that expertise, past tense. You terminated my contract because my approach was outdated, remember? You hired CloudScale because they were experts in modern cloud architecture. Another long silence. Emerson, I understand you're upset about how your departure was handled, but this is bigger than personnel issues. This is about 850,000 customers who can't access their accounts. This is about a company that employs 890 people whose jobs are at risk if we can't recover. I'm not upset, Yvette. I'm simply explaining that you hired consultants specifically to replace my outdated expertise with modern cloud-native solutions. Those consultants should be able to resolve any issues that arise from their implementation. They can't. They've admitted they can't. We need you. I have commitments to other clients today. The earliest I could potentially review your situation would be Monday morning. We can't wait until Monday. Every hour of downtime costs us $180,000, plus unmeasurable reputational damage. Name your rate. Whatever you want, we'll pay it. I thought about that for a moment. Thought about Kelvin's confident dismissal of my expertise. Thought about CloudScale's aggressive migration timeline. Thought about 22 years of institutional knowledge that had been categorized as outdated and then became the only thing that could save the company. My emergency consulting rate is $2,200 per hour. Given the complexity of what you're describing, I estimate this will require a minimum of 100 hours to fully resolve. That includes data recovery, system stabilization, and implementing safeguards to prevent recurrence. That's $220,000 total. Payment in full, wired to my business account before I begin any diagnostic work. Silence. I could practically hear her calculating whether the company could afford that. That's acceptable. I'll have our CFO wire the payment immediately. How soon can you start? As soon as I confirm the wire transfer has cleared, I'll need complete administrative access to all database systems, all cloud infrastructure, all monitoring tools, and all documentation from CloudScale's migration project. I'll also need a written acknowledgement from Halcyon that my consulting engagement is limited to data recovery and system stabilization, and that I'm not responsible for any decisions made by Kelvin Pryor or CloudScale Consulting that contributed to this situation. I'll have legal draft that acknowledgement immediately. One more thing. I work alone on recovery operations like this. No CloudScale personnel involved. No interference from Kelvin or anyone else on your technical team. If you want me to fix this, I need complete autonomy to do it my way. Done. I'll send you the access credentials and legal acknowledgement within the hour. The wire transfer cleared my account at 11:23 a.m., $220,000. Yvette wasn't exaggerating about how desperate they were. I arrived at Halcyon's offices at 12:15 p.m. The building felt different, quieter, more tense. Everyone knew the systems were down. Everyone understood what that meant for the company. Yvette met me in the lobby, personally. Emerson, thank you for coming. I've set up a dedicated workspace for you on the 4th floor. You have complete access to everything, whatever you need. I need to understand exactly what CloudScale did during the migration and cutover. Every configuration change, every data transformation, every automation script they ran, everything. I'll have IT provide you with their complete project documentation. I spent the next 4 hours reviewing CloudScale's migration documentation, examining database logs, analyzing corruption patterns, and reconstructing exactly what had failed and why. The timestamp conversion issue was obvious once I understood their architecture decisions. The corruption pattern was predictable once I saw how they'd configured conflict resolution. What wasn't obvious was how to recover the corrupted data without losing transactions. Here's the problem. When distributed databases become corrupted due to replication conflicts, you have 2 recovery options. Option 1, restore from the last clean backup before corruption occurred, accepting the loss of all transactions after that backup. Option 2, attempt to reconstruct valid data from the corrupted databases by identifying and correcting the conflicts that caused corruption. Option 1 was safe but unacceptable. Losing 28 million transactions would destroy customer trust and potentially trigger regulatory investigations. Option 2 was technically possible, but extremely risky. If you made mistakes during reconstruction, you could make the corruption worse or create new inconsistencies. I chose option 2 because I understood something CloudScale didn't. I knew exactly how the conflict resolution algorithms worked because I'd designed them. I knew how transaction timestamps should be interpreted because I'd written the timestamp handling code. I knew how to identify valid versus corrupted records because I'd spent 22 years managing edge cases in this exact system. That institutional knowledge was outdated. It was also the only thing that could recover Halcyon's data. I started by creating isolated copies of all corrupted databases so I could work with the data without risking further damage to production systems. Then I wrote custom scripts to analyze transaction logs, identify timestamp inconsistencies, determine which records were valid, and reconstruct correct transaction sequences. This wasn't something you could do with commercial database tools. This required understanding the specific architecture, the specific business logic, the specific edge cases that existed in Halcyon systems. It required expertise that had taken 22 years to develop. By 9:30 p.m. Saturday, I'd successfully reconstructed approximately 60% of the corrupted data. By 3 a.m. Sunday morning, I'd reached 85%. By 10 a.m. Sunday, I had 97% of transactions recovered with validated accuracy. The remaining 3% were edge cases that required manual review, transactions that had been processed during the exact moments when corruption was most severe. I spent Sunday afternoon reviewing those edge cases with Tamsin's operations team, verifying transaction details against customer service records and external payment processor logs. By 7:00 p.m. Sunday evening, we'd validated all but 140 transactions out of 28 million. Those 140 transactions would need to be manually re-entered based on customer service documentation. At 8:30 p.m. Sunday evening, 44 hours after the crash, I brought Halcyon's production databases back online. Systems were stable. Data was consistent across all regional databases. Transaction processing was functional. I'd recovered 95% of their data without any losses that would impact customers or regulatory compliance. Yvette came down to the fourth-floor workspace at 9:15 p.m. She looked exhausted. It's working. Customer accounts are accessible. Transactions are processing normally. How did you do this? I understood your database architecture because I designed it. I understood how the corruption occurred because I understood how CloudScale's migration broke timestamp handling. I understood how to recover the data because I spent 22 years managing edge cases in these exact systems. Could CloudScale have done this? No. They don't have institutional knowledge of your systems. They're experts in cloud migrations. But they're not experts in your specific database architecture. That expertise took 22 years to develop. You can't buy it from a consulting firm. Yvette sat down heavily in a chair. Kelvin made a catastrophic error in judgment. Kelvin made a common error. He confused modern with better. Cloud infrastructure is modern. It's not automatically better. Better requires understanding why your current systems work the way they do before changing them. What should we have done differently? You should have planned the migration over 18 months instead of 4 days. You should have conducted comprehensive testing in non-production environments. You should have maintained my consulting contract during the transition to provide institutional knowledge and oversight. You should have prioritized operational stability over aggressive timelines. Why didn't you warn us this would happen? I did. Kelvin wasn't interested in warnings from an outdated consultant. He was interested in impressive modernization stories for board presentations. Monday morning, the full leadership team met in the executive conference room at 8 a.m. Yvette, Kelvin, Tamsin, the CFO, the general counsel, and 4 other senior executives. I was invited to present a post-incident analysis. I kept it brief. CloudScale's migration was improperly planned and improperly executed. They prioritized speed over safety, ignored institutional knowledge about your systems, and implemented architectural changes without understanding why your original systems were designed their specific way. The timestamp conversion bug was avoidable with proper testing. The corruption was predictable given their conflict resolution configuration. The crash was inevitable once they executed cutover without validating data consistency. Kelvin looked defensive. CloudScale is a respected consulting firm with an excellent track record. CloudScale is excellent at aggressive cloud migrations for companies that don't have complex legacy systems and deep institutional knowledge requirements. They're not appropriate for situations like Halcyon's, where 22 years of business logic is embedded in database architecture. So, you're saying we shouldn't modernize our infrastructure? I'm saying modernization is a tool, not a goal. You modernize when modern architecture solves specific business problems better than existing architecture. You don't modernize because cloud native sounds impressive in board presentations. Yvette spoke up. What would proper modernization look like for Halcyon? 18-month timeline, comprehensive architectural review to understand why current systems work their specific way, phased migration testing extensively in non-production environments, maintained institutional knowledge oversight during transition, prioritizing operational stability over aggressive timelines, and most importantly, accepting that some legacy systems are legacy because they work extremely well, and replacing them is higher risk than maintaining them. The room was silent. Finally, the general counsel asked, "What's the total damage from this incident?" 44 hours of complete downtime, approximately $7.9 million in lost transaction revenue, unmeasurable reputational damage with customers, $220,000 in emergency recovery consulting fees, CloudScale's migration consulting fees, which I assume were substantial, and ongoing costs to stabilize systems and implement proper safeguards. My estimate, approximately $12 million total when you account for everything. The CFO looked like he might be sick. $12 million. That's the cost of prioritizing aggressive timelines over institutional knowledge. You tried to migrate 22 years of database architecture in 4 days. This is what happens when you make that decision. After the meeting, Yvette asked me to stay. Emmersson, I want to offer you a permanent position. Chief Database Architect. $240,000 base salary plus equity. Full authority over database infrastructure and architecture decisions. We need your expertise. I thought about that for exactly 3 seconds. I appreciate the offer, but I'm declining. I have consulting clients who value my expertise and don't call it outdated. I'm not interested in returning to an organization that needed a $12 million disaster to understand why institutional knowledge matters. What about a long-term consulting arrangement? We clearly need ongoing oversight of our database systems. I'll consider a limited consulting arrangement. Monthly infrastructure reviews, crisis availability for genuine emergencies, architectural consulting for major changes. $15,000 monthly retainer plus $2,200 hourly for active work. 1-year contract, renewable annually at my discretion. That's acceptable. I'll have legal draft the contract. I left Halcyon at 2:30 p.m. on Monday, March 25th. 10 days after they'd terminated my contract for being outdated. I just made $220,000 for 44 hours of emergency work, plus I had a new consulting arrangement worth $180,000 annually for approximately 10 to 15 hours of monthly work. Kelvin lasted 6 weeks. In May 2024, Halcyon announced he was pursuing other opportunities. Translation: the board terminated him after the $12 million disaster he'd created with his aggressive modernization timeline. CloudScale sued Halcyon for the remainder of their consulting fees, approximately $780,000, that Halcyon refused to pay after the crash. Halcyon countersued for negligent performance and breach of professional standards. They settled out of court for undisclosed terms, but industry contacts told me CloudScale returned their entire fee and paid an additional $400,000 to avoid further litigation. Over the next year, I built a specialized consulting practice, helping companies avoid exactly the mistakes Halcyon had made. My expertise in database architecture, disaster recovery, and institutional knowledge preservation became increasingly valuable as more companies attempted aggressive cloud migrations without proper planning. By late 2024, I was managing 6 long-term consulting contracts, similar to Halcyon's arrangement. Annual revenue from those contracts alone was approximately $920,000, plus additional project work. I was making significantly more than I'd ever made as Halcyon's full-time consultant, working fewer hours, with better clients who valued expertise over modernization theatrics. The lesson isn't that cloud migration is bad or that legacy systems are always better. The lesson is that modern and outdated are meaningless categories without context. Technology is good or bad, based on how well it solves specific business problems, not based on how recently it was invented. Halcyon's database architecture wasn't outdated. It was optimized through 22 years of iterative refinement for their specific requirements. Replacing it with modern cloud infrastructure without understanding why it worked created a $12 million disaster. Kelvin didn't understand that distinction. He saw legacy and assumed bad. He saw cloud native and assumed better. He saw 22 years of institutional knowledge and called it outdated. Then he fired the person who held that knowledge and tried to replace him with consultants who specialized in speed over understanding. 3 days later, he was calling me at 11 p.m., offering to pay whatever I wanted to fix the disaster he'd created. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't proving people wrong. It's letting them experience the full consequences of their decisions and then charging them premium rates to fix what they broke. I didn't cause Halcyon's database crash. I didn't sabotage CloudScale's migration. I didn't create the disaster that cost them $12 million. I simply wasn't there to prevent it anymore because I was outdated. That turned out to be the most expensive word Kelvin Pryor ever used.